So, I have thoughts today. I will jump right in. This is popping in my head yesterday, and it's staying in my head today. But I think one thing that I think about, not often, but often enough, is the relationship between video games and mental health. And there's a lot of different routes that I can go. I know there's been a lot of discussion over the years about video games and violence, but also how they utilize like a really good form. I don't know if it's not technically marketing, but just keeping you engaged and accessing parts of your brain that keep you a little bit addicted to a process or always feeling like you're really close to the next thing. And there's a lot of really good information to draw from that. It's where a lot of people will talk about gamifying your day-to-day. If you can keep little goals really close, or having like upgrades in life and all this other stuff. And I think life is more than trying to make it feel like a video game. But one really interesting thing that I think about from time to time is about difficulty levels and challenges in video games. So obviously some level of understanding video games is relevant to this, but I don't know how long ago it was, but a bit of time ago. For me, being someone who does enjoy video games and goes through phases of playing a fair amount to very little, and just it's an enjoyable pastime like reading to me, there is one decision that I made a while back, and it has been a really fun decision for me, and I'm going to apply that to mental health and how I actually think it paints a really good picture on mental health in general, specifically hope and being able to move through something difficult with excitement and potentially even joy. So I'll use an example. For people who know video games, a lot of them will have difficulty levels. So, one of the ones that I loved growing up and still really enjoy is Halo, which has always had 4 difficulties. So easy, normal, heroic, and legendary, or you could say hard and expert, but 4 difficulty levels, and the game gets harder on each one of those. So the things that make it harder are just modifiers to the game. So there's not more or less resources, it's just harder to stay alive. Enemies kill you faster, and they take more to kill. It just balanced out the game like that. And a lot of games use that structure, having maybe 3 to 4 difficulty levels, and this easy, normal, hard, extra hard kind of thing. It's not uncommon. And one of the things that I decided was that I think there's 2 things to keep in mind. One is games are typically fun when there's a challenge to them. So a lot of times when people play games on a very easy mode, it's because they're actually just more interested in the story. That's what's fun. Like they would with a novel or a movie. They just want to know what happens. They don't want to be dying a lot. So they pick a story mode of a game, or they choose the easiest option so they can just kind of move through it without much difficulty. People who are wanting a challenge and who are wanting to overcome something, that's when the difficulty matters. If you're used to playing video games and you're used to a series of games like Halo or Call of Duty, or things that release often enough that have difficulty levels, you might say, well, I'm used to doing these on easy and it's too easy now, so I'm gonna do normal. Or I'm used to doing these on normal, so I'm gonna do hard. And you pick harder difficulties for more of a challenge. So one thing that I have started doing is, for games that I have never played, I will often start on the hardest difficulty option possible. That's the change that I made. And now some games, that hardest level is meant to be way too hard, and it's got extra things, like if you die you have to start the whole game over or something like that. But for most of them, it is just a harder version of it, and they maybe add modifiers to make it even harder. And one thing that I have learned from this experience, and that I think is applicable, And I've been doing it in other areas of my life with challenges. Like if you do a workout video and they say this person's doing the hard version, this person's doing the intermediate, pick who you follow. I always follow the hard person. And my mindset there is it's easier to go from hard to easier than from easy to harder. If you start at this really difficult level, it's always easier to drop down a notch if you need the help. It is never easier to go up to the harder one. At least I can't think of examples. There might be some. So what that means is if I'm playing a new game, never played it before, and I start on the hardest level, all I know is that level. I have information that there is an easier way to do this potentially, but my only experience is difficult. And what's interesting is when that's your only experience, it doesn't necessarily click in my mind that it's hard. It just is what it is. So you might be able to see where I'm heading with this and what I'm thinking. But if you just have an experience, this is what this experience is like, then that's just it. And I think a lot of people, when they hear the word hard, they think of something. So anyone who's watching, if you think about, if I say, hey, I have a game recommendation for you, and the game is very hard. Just think about what goes through your mind, like what would make a game hard. Or if I said it's really easy, what goes through your mind? And you might think of two different genres of games, or you might think, but you have often default things that'll start to come up. If I say it's really hard, your first thought might be like, oh, if you die, there's a lot of consequences, or enemies are really difficult, or you can't take much damage, or maybe it's one where if you're spotted, it doesn't work. And then if I say easy, if you're like me, I think more peaceful games. Like, oh, I hear you probably can't really die, or they maybe make it really focused on the story and you're just kind of, it's like an interactive movie. That's what I think. Other people are going to have different thoughts. But you have a default thought when you hear difficulty. And it's based on previous experiences and your ability to interact with those experiences. So if I tell, if I take a Call of Duty game or something like that, and you hand it to someone who's never played a video game, and you put them on easy, and you're like, this is really easy. This is the easy one, you'll be fine. But they've never played one. There's a learning curve, using a controller, understanding the hand-eye input, and having any idea what's happening on the screen. Even if you're being told, hey, RT or right trigger or whatever shoots the gun. Well, you'd have to look at the controller and figure out what that is. And then when it pops up on your screen again, you have to look down and figure out what that is. Just like anyone who's played maybe an Xbox and then moves to a PlayStation or whatever Nintendo does at the time, those controls change and move, and you have to learn what those are. Some of it becomes intuitive for people who've played a lot of games. A lot of games have the same general button for shooting in the same general spot. That's pretty normal. You don't have to know the name of the button. You can probably guess, but that's intuition. You're making an educated guess based on all your previous experience. So my point being, easiness and difficulty in terms of, easy and hard, rather, that's relative to the person's past experiences. And past experiences include practice at something. So training to do better, which that can be sports, but it can also be video games. You play them often, you will likely get better at the thing that you're playing. That's why a lot of games, as you play them, that game itself actually gets harder throughout. Even if you're playing on one difficulty level, it'll get harder over the course of the game because it's assuming that you are learning how to do it better. You're learning how the game's made, you're learning what's going on, and that does not have to be combat games. That can be anything, any game at all. Typically it gets harder over time because it expects that you are learning and developing. So the point that I'm making is if you come into something on a harder difficulty, so to speak, you will take that as this is just the norm. But if you come into it from a perspective of let me try easy, and I'm not criticizing that, if games especially, if you're going in trying to have fun, starting too hard is not going to do that. But the way that I would translate this into mental health, and I'm going to make one more point about games that will tie this right in, because there's one other built-in assumption with a video game that is not built in with life struggles. Video games are designed to be beaten as well, generally speaking. There's maybe one in a blue moon that's supposed to be borderline impossible. But part of the fun of it is you can beat it. And if a game has a higher difficulty level, the implication there is that it's beatable on that difficulty level. So easy or hard, they're both possible to win the game and to end successfully, even though one's easy and one's hard. And this is, I think, more interesting than people understand. If games can have different difficulty levels, but they are still beatable, it means that there is a level of either skill or determination that can get you through it. And me talking to people who have played hard games a lot and they really like it, myself included, a lot of the time they will tell you that they're actually not very good at games. This is really interesting. What they're good at is continuing to try and continuing to learn from their mistakes. So one thing that's very interesting about a video game is if you play and you die, usually for most games, when you start again, you will face the same exact challenge. You go into a room, and this can be true for a combat game or even a puzzle game. You may have I'll use puzzle for this example. You have 60 seconds to solve this puzzle, or it resets you. You go into an empty room or a room you've never been in. There's stuff everywhere, and you don't know how to solve it. And you just have to start guessing. And every 60 seconds, it starts you back over. But if you're learning from each round, then you're not starting from square one. So there might have been a table with 10 different buttons, and you realize that button 9 turns something on, the other 9 buttons don't do anything. When you restart that, you're just going to press button 9. You're not going to attempt the other ones, and you're going to go to the door that opens. And you've now sped that process up because there's no trial and error anymore. You understand that. You might have to figure out more things later, but you get it. Same with a combat game. You start to learn, okay, this is the mechanics. Enemies come through there. They come in this way. I can take it this approach. I can do this approach. I can try. And you get better at it through repetition. And it's not just doing it over and over. It's also doing it over and over with a desire to learn and see if you can refine it. But the idea is, yeah, I can get through this. And you can. So that's the piece that to me translates to mental health, is you understand that a game is meant to be beat. And if you look at life, and there's a little bit of a philosophical implication that I think has to be present first. Now, as a therapist, I believe this truly. There's no problem that any person faces that has not been faced by another person before. What that means is if you are struggling with something, you are not the first person to struggle with that. You aren't. Everyone has moments where they're like, nobody gets it. Nobody feels like me. This is just not true. It's true on a level of you have a unique experience that is unique to you in this specific time, and you're living it based on your whole past experience and where you're located, and that makes it wildly unique. But if someone comes in with debilitating anxiety, you are not the first person to deal with that. You're the first person to deal with it your unique way, but you're not the first person to deal with that. In the same way that 1,000 people can play one video game level, and they are not the only person to play it. Now they're going to approach it maybe their own way, and their knowledge of video games is going to inform how they come into it because they have a unique past. But they're all playing the same level, and it is a beatable level. It just is. And it might take time. Like if you give the controller to a 4-year-old, they might not be able to get it, or someone who has never played a video game, and they might be really slow, where someone else gets it first try, they're done in 20 minutes, and this other person, it actually takes a long time. Maybe they've I'm gonna do this, and it takes them months, but they'll get it done because it's doable. But yes, your starting point does change your ability to accomplish that well. Even people who've played video games, if you completely new genre of game that you've never played, or a completely foreign control system, you're gonna have to learn. So the point there, and that's the implication, is the belief you have to know that you're not the only person to go through what you're going through. And that just really is true. Maybe there are situations that are really, really unique, or there's 20 different things that all combine into this, but at the end of the day, those are still 20 different beatable things. the same way that a video game with 20 levels, to beat the game, you have to beat each level. But the overall thing is just approach it level by level. If you're coming in with anxiety, depression, you're dealing with grief, you're struggling to pay bills, your friends aren't wanting to spend time with you, your hobbies aren't fun anymore, your local coffee shop that you go to every day and enjoy the people there closed down, and you can't, like, you're dealing with all these things, but each one of those is fixable, or at least solvable to some extent. So some issues you can't fix, right? If you used to be able to walk and now you're wheelchair bound and you need to go to therapy to work through that life change, assuming you're legitimately wheelchair bound now, and that's the prognosis that's permanent, we're not going to be able to reverse that and make it fixable. But we can solve the issue of the struggle that you're going through mentally, and we can learn how to work around it. Why? Because for forever, people have had to deal with not being able to walk, and they've figured it out. Now, there might be certain sacrifices, but it can be figured out. Most things are figure outable, and most things you can make it through. And so with the video game analogy that I'm trying to get at here is, if you can go in with the mindset of this is overcomable and this is beatable, you'll get through it. Having hope will get you through, and it gives you energy for it. If I think a level is beatable, I'm going to be more likely to move through it. And the more you can break down what that level is, the better. So, for instance, if it's a really hard level and you've lost it 100 times in a row, it's that hard, and you might think, oh, this isn't going anywhere, I've lost 100 times. But let's say, just for super simple conversation, the level, it has 30 different rooms that you have to go through. And you've lost 100 times, but you've gone from dying in room 1 or losing in room 1 to now you're making it to room 27. Okay, so 27 to 30, you're like 90% the way there. It's very close. That's where breaking things down into smaller sections. So someone who is, I'll use the same example. They are working through, I can't walk anymore, and most days now it's not an issue. But maybe they used to do a lot of running, and maybe they were even ultra marathon runners. And I use that example because it's not talked about all the time, but it does come up. And then maybe an Instagram post or an old friend reaches out to them and it gets brought up, and they're like, man, I missed that. And they feel it and they're sad. That doesn't mean they haven't made progress. And they might say, man, I just wanted to go a year without being upset that I'm in a wheelchair. And then one day out of that year, they were upset. Versus every day originally. That is progress. People miss that a lot. And that's one of the things I utilize with my practice, is when you feel negative experiences, negative emotions, or distress, how long it lasts, how often it happens, and how intense it feels. These are things that I would assess from frequency, duration, and I'm just blanking on my own structure. Frequency, duration, and intensity. So frequency, how often do you experience this? Duration, when you experience it, how long are you experiencing it for? So I'll keep going. And intensity, on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is that experience? So they might say, well, frequency, I'm thinking about this 7 days a week, and when it comes up, I can't get out of my head all day. It's like 12 hours, and I'm at like an 8 out of 10 stressed about it. It's like, okay, that's a lot. Let's say we're doing work, and 4 months later, they say, I only think about it 5 days a week now, and when I think about it, it does stick around, but it's gone after 8. It only stays for 8 hours, and when I feel it, it's only a 6 out of 10. That person would still probably say that experience sucks. But keep in mind, they went from 7 days down to 5 days, from 12 hours down to 8 hours, and from an 8 out of a 10 to, like a 6 out of a 10. So they've improved actually a lot. It's a notable improvement percentage-wise. It's substantial. I think the numbers that I gave right there, just a loose call out, is probably about a 20% reduction I don't know. We'll assume for a second. Someone came into my room and I said, hey, within 3 to 4 months, you will feel 20% better. Will this be worth your time? And we're not going to be done there, but by month 3 or month 4, you'll be 20% better than you are now. And then we'll keep going. I think most people would be happy to know that. I think the hard part is it's not an all or nothing, and it's because most changes aren't all or nothing or overnight. Same with the video game example. If you start something hard, it's going to be hard. That's the point of it. But if you can believe that it is beatable, like me or anyone else when you play a video game, I think it can be beat, and I want to beat it. Those are both relevant because I also think if I tried hard enough, I could become an astronaut and go to space. But if I don't want to do that, that doesn't help me to start working towards that, right? So believing you can do something is not the same as wanting to, or vice versa. If you want to do something, it doesn't mean you believe you can. So both of those are important. You have to want to actually be better, and you have to believe that you can. So I believe I can be less anxious, and I want to be less anxious. Great. Problem solved. Over time. You can do it. Even if, someone plays a 4-hour game, not a lot of those, but people make them and they're beatable and they have difficulty levels in 4 hours. It's like, all right, this is going to be hard, and maybe because I'm playing on the hardest difficulty, it actually took me 10 hours to beat it, but I got done. Versus someone starting a game that's like, hey, on easy mode, this takes 50 hours. And you're like, oh, I'm doing hard mode. And they're like, oh, well, we are guessing that takes closer to 200 hours. You might be like, oh my gosh, but it's still doable, and you can do it if you want. Same with anyone who starts learning a sport, learning a new language, learning an instrument, any new skill. You will struggle to start learning, but you're starting because you know that the end is a real possibility. You know that by the end of it, you can be an athlete. You can be fluent in a new language. You can be very good at an instrument. Does this make sense? Because you want to do it and you believe you can do it. Now, all of us have probably stories of getting better at something because we had to do them, people forced us to, or life circumstances, you had to figure it out. The amount of people I've talked to that their income has gone up because they just had to, they had a surprise kid and it ended up being twins or something, or their life fell in hard times and they actually figured it out. It's that click of I either believing strongly that I can, or also being backed into a corner of like, I have to do this. And it's amazing what people can just figure out how to do. And the reason is because all of it is figure outable. And yes, there are sacrifices. So if I went online and Googled like what are the top 10 hardest video games to beat, and I chose to play one, I would have to know that I'm going to have to sacrifice at the bare minimum playing other games. Because if this takes 200, 300 hours to beat, and that's the assumed duration, if I found that, like people are like, hey, this is very hard to do, and it takes the average person 200 to 300 hours to do it, I'd be committing to a long time of my video game experience. So maybe normally I would like, oh, I want to play this game with friends, or I want to play these 10 games over the next year, but now it might just be this one. So there is sacrifice. And then if I made it a really big goal of like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it as quick as I can, I'm going to knock it out. And then I might start sacrificing other hobbies and other activities and other time with people. And you do have to decide how intense you want to go at something. But the point that I'm making is these things are doable. They're doable. People can get better. And losing hope is one of the, worst tools. And I do think there's a difference between having false expectations and having properly set hope. But the issue is most people that are trying to get better, in my experience, they struggle way more with believing in themselves than overestimating themselves. Most people I interact with that are dealing with self-worth issues or anxiety or depression issues, they're more likely going to feel hopelessness and be like, this isn't possible. So there's some subjectivity, like, to understand that if you lean towards hopelessness, then you probably need a lot more hope and a lot more intentionality and belief that things are overcomable. And if you're like a serial optimist who fails all the time at things because you're too grandiose with your ideas and you're jumping from thing to thing and you feel discontent. Well, that's going to be a different issue. And mostly what I'm focusing on here is when you find the problem, you're like, it's anxiety, it's my mindset, it's my body. And it's like, once you figure that out, if you're like, I can't stand my body anymore, it's causing me pain and problems, like I'm overweight, I'm not moving around well enough, I'm not taking care of my heart. Once you figure that out, then you just start working. And you might have to learn, just like a game, you might start with like, well, I've heard that if you eat better and if you exercise, that's better. Great. Start doing both of those things, and you don't need an expert to tell you what that is. You'll want to start integrating those people. But if I asked anyone who's never exercised and they come to me and they say, I need to start exercising for my health, I know it, and they believe it and they want it, and they say, where should I start? I can just say, what's something that you could do to exercise? And they might, I could go on walks. Great. What's something you could start to do to eat better? Well, I eat a pint of ice cream every night. I think I could eat a little bit less than that. Great. Are those two things going to cure their issues? No, but they're steps in the right direction. Just like someone trying out a level, they might say, well, I'm gonna try this route because I know that generally this helps. And then, okay, great. And then if that works, add to that route, add to that thing, add to that technique. So that walking might turn into gym visits and lifting weights. It might eventually turn into, if you can afford it, a personal trainer, or finding videos online to help learn how to better exercise, or getting connected with the community and learning from people who do exercise at your gym or out and about. And that's a lifestyle change of changing friends or adding friends who can benefit you in that way. Same with eating. That person might start doing Google searching, like, oh, I'm not getting enough water, I should be doing that. Or, you know what, I see all these foods are banned in Europe and I don't know why. It's like, okay, maybe I'll stop eating high fructose corn syrup or something like that. And all these things, you can find people who say, oh, that's not good research, and right after someone's like, oh, it is good research. But the point is, there are stories of people who can lose weight healthily and get fit healthily. That means you can also do that. And that's an example too, because I know a lot of people say, well, my body just doesn't do that. But it does. You can get healthier. You're not going to look like that model or that person. Just like when you're mentally healthy, doesn't mean you're going to look like the most mentally healthy person you know. There's going to be a version of you that looks a certain way when it is mentally healthy, and a version of you that looks a certain way when it is physically healthy. So me at my physical prime will look different than any of my brothers at their physical prime. Even though we're very similar, especially from like a DNA genetic standpoint, we will have different ways that we look when we are our healthiest, because we have different bodies and because we have different personalities and mindsets. So that's one way that I think video games can actually be a very, very good insight. And so my point with that is, if you go in with it with those mindsets and also add in the idea of like, this is just the way to do it. Same with starting on a hard difficulty. It's like this can be beat on the hard difficulty. Maybe my life is starting on a hard difficulty, but it can be beat. And I'm not comparing myself to other people. I'm going to feel accomplished when I beat it. And someone else who did it easier, you don't have to be rude, but you can be like, my situation's harder. In your mind, think that, right? And I'm still going to get through it. And we can both be happy that we made it through. And I feel really satisfied that I did it on a harder difficulty. Totally fine if you didn't. Did you enjoy it? Are you doing great? Fantastic. We don't need to be comparing in a negative way. So, as just a fun connection that I've made, there's a lot of connections. I think I don't think people need to play video games by any means. I think there's great arguments for not playing them. I also think there's a lot that can be learned from them and what they do to the mind, and lessons that can be learned. So yeah, take that for what you will, but that's just a really cool concept that was on my mind and I thought I'd share.